I was home alone with my dog when someone started knocking on every side of the house at once, and I remember standing still, trying to convince myself there was a logical explanation for what I was hearing. Little did I know that the real reason behind it was nothing I could have ever dreamed of. This happened when I was 20, back in 2008, living in a quiet suburb outside Columbus, where nights usually passed without anything unusual happening. My parents had gone out for the night, leaving me alone with our black lab, Abby, who normally spent evenings sleeping at the foot of the couch or following me from room to room. I was upstairs on the computer, talking to friends online, watching random videos, just passing the time in that comfortable, uneventful way nights often feel. Or everything was normal in the way normal only feels suspicious in retrospect, like the calm before something you didn't expect to notice. Then Abby started barking, and it wasn't her usual alert bark that meant someone was outside or a neighbor had walked too close to the property. Her barks were becoming more alarming, like she had locked on to something she couldn't identify but didn't trust at all. I paused what I was doing and listened, expecting footsteps or a car engine or anything that would make sense of her reaction. But the barking didn't stop. It kept going in bursts, like she was tracking movement that kept changing direction around the house. I got up and walked into the living room, trying to stay calm, even though something about her tone made the air feel heavier than usual. And Abby was standing near the window facing the driveway, barking non-stop like she was trying to warn something off that I couldn't see. I looked outside expecting headlights or a shadow moving across the street, but there was only one parked car and no activity. That's when the first uneasy thought hit me. Not fear yet, just the sense that something didn't match how things were supposed to be. I told myself it was nothing serious, maybe a passing car or a neighbor closing a gate harder than usual, something explainable. We lived close to a main road, so unfamiliar sounds weren't rare, and I leaned on that logic because it felt safer than uncertainty. I went back upstairs, trying to ignore Abby's continued barking, as nothing more than her being overly alert to things that didn't matter. But even from upstairs, I could tell she wasn't calming down. She kept reacting like she was following movement through invisible spaces. A few minutes later, I heard something that didn't belong to any normal night in the house, a knock at the front door. It started softly, then repeated, and I froze because I knew immediately it was too late for anyone I was expecting. I walked down the hallway slowly, trying to rationalize it as a mistake, a delivery, or maybe wind hitting something loose outside. Then it came again. Another knock, louder this time, more deliberate, like whoever was outside knew someone was inside watching. I checked the front window first, but there was nothing there. No car pulling away, no shadow, no movement at all. Just the porch light and the stillness beyond it, and the kind of silence that makes sound feel sharper than it should. Goosebumps rose all over my skin because Abby had stopped barking at the window and was now pacing aggressively behind me in the hallway. Then a second sound came, not from the front anymore, but from the side of the house. I heard another knock, and this time it didn't feel random. It felt like someone had moved around the property with intent. The side of the house wasn't visible from the street, and reaching it meant walking around the entire yard and under the deck. Whoever was there wasn't just passing by, they knew the layout well enough to move through it without hesitation. Abby ran toward the hallway, barking again, louder now, like she was trying to push something away by force alone. Then I heard something that made my stomach drop immediately. The basement door, or more specifically, the handle being tested from outside. It wasn't a knock anymore, it was a slow, deliberate rattling, metal shifting against metal like someone was checking for weakness. The basement wasn't visible from the front at all, and you couldn't accidentally stumble onto it without knowing exactly where to go. That detail made everything feel worse, because it meant whoever was there wasn't guessing. They were navigating. Abby ran downstairs immediately, barking at full force. and I followed a few steps behind her without thinking through what I was doing. Halfway down, her barking suddenly stopped, and the silence that replaced it felt heavier than any sound I had heard that night. I froze at the top of the stairs, listening, waiting for her to bark again or come running back up like she usually would. Instead, I heard a low growl from below, deep and unfamiliar, like she was facing something she didn't recognize as human or animal. Then she ran back upstairs suddenly, fast and panicked, and I grabbed her instinctively as she reached the hallway. My mind was racing, trying to decide what to do, who to call, whether I should even open my mouth and make noise. I backed into my room, locked the door, and reached for the house phone because that was still our only reliable option then. Abby stayed pressed against my leg, tense and alert, staring at the hallway like something might follow her through it. I was about to call my older brother, who lived nearby, because he was the only person I trusted to actually come quickly. But before I could dial, I heard something outside again, the front door opening like someone had just walked in without hesitation. My entire body went cold because I hadn't heard keys, footsteps, or anything that should have explained how that door moved. Abby bolted out of the room immediately, disappearing down the hallway before I could stop her. Then I heard voices, and they weren't strangers. They were familiar, calm, and completely out of place for what I had just experienced. I ran into the living room and saw my parents standing there, acting confused but normal, like nothing unusual had happened at all. Abby was already circling them, wagging slightly now, as if her entire reaction earlier had been reset in an instant. My brain couldn't reconcile the shift. It was like stepping out of one reality and into another without warning. I started explaining everything at once. The knocking, the basement, Abby's behavior, the feeling that someone had been moving around the house. My mum looked unsettled, but my dad didn't respond right away. He just listened with a focused, unreadable expression. Then he slowly walked through the house with a flashlight, checking rooms, corners, and eventually the basement entrance outside. He came back with nothing. No signs of entry, no footprints, no damage, nothing that matched what I had experienced. Still, I didn't sleep that night because even though the house was quiet again, it didn't feel like the same quiet anymore. Every sound felt delayed, like the house was remembering something I couldn't see, and that made it harder to relax. I kept replaying the knocking in my head, trying to map it logically, but nothing aligned in a way that made sense. And what bothered me most was how specific it had felt, like someone moving with purpose rather than panic or confusion. The next afternoon, there was a knock at the front door, and I reacted instantly before I even thought about it. I stepped back as my dad opened it, already bracing for something I couldn't explain again. Standing there was a family member, holding an envelope, acting calm in a way that felt slightly too controlled for the situation. He greeted my dad casually, like the timing of his visit was completely ordinary and nothing needed to be questioned. I caught parts of the conversation from a distance, something about stopping by the night before to drop something off. My dad's posture changed immediately, like a puzzle piece had suddenly clicked into place that he didn't like the shape of. The conversation ended quickly, and the door shut harder than normal, leaving a tension that lingered in the room afterward. My dad came back holding the envelope like he didn't want to acknowledge what it represented. Inside was a small card and a gift voucher, a thank you note for helping with a family-related errand earlier in the week. But none of it explained why he would come at that hour, or why he would move around the house the way I remembered. We later found out he'd been struggling with a severe psychological illness that made him behave in absurd ways. My dad told me firmly not to be alone with him again, and the tone made it clear it wasn't a suggestion. After that day, everything about how we interacted with him changed quietly, without confrontation or explanation. And even now, years later, I still think about that night because memory doesn't soften things that never fully make sense. For a few hours, I was convinced someone was breaking into the house from every direction at once. I heard it, I felt it, and I still can't fully explain how it all lined up the way it did. Because in the end, it wasn't a stranger at all. It was someone who already knew exactly where everything was. For 2 nights, I thought someone was trying to get into my room. Later, I realized the worst possibility was that they'd already been inside the entire time. When I was 23, I rented an apartment in the duplex of a friend, and while I had begged for a room upstairs, I ended up settling for the room downstairs. It wasn't a real apartment exactly, more like a finished basement with its own bedroom, bathroom, living room, and side entrance. But it was cheap, and after moving out of my old place, cheap was all I cared about. The upstairs belonged to my friend and his wife, though they traveled constantly for work and were gone most weekends. The basement connected to the upstairs through a stairway door that locked from both sides. Most of the time I kept it locked, but whenever they left town, I'd leave it open because the upstairs kitchen was bigger and honestly less depressing than mine. One Friday night, my friends Micah and Phil came over to watch a late basketball game. We ordered takeout, drank too much, and spent most of the night yelling at the TV loud enough for the neighbors to probably hate us. At some point after midnight, we turned the music down and started passing out wherever we landed. Micah took the couch. Phil claimed the recliner. I locked my bedroom door out of habit and went to sleep. Sometime during the night, I woke up suddenly. At first, I didn't know why. Then I heard footsteps upstairs. It didn't sound like someone was pacing or wandering. It was just movement across the kitchen floor directly above me. I checked my phone. It was exactly 3:14 a.m. I assumed one of my friends had gone upstairs looking for water, aspirin or something, so I closed my eyes again. Then my doorknob turned slowly, like someone was being careful not to make noise. I opened my eyes immediately and stared at the dark outline of my bedroom door. The handle twisted once and stopped, then twisted again. I remember thinking it was probably Micah messing around because he'd had way too much to drink earlier, but whoever was outside didn't say anything. Eventually, the movement stopped completely. I stayed awake for another 10 minutes before finally drifting back to sleep. The next morning, Micah had already left for work. Phil was still asleep in the recliner. When he woke up, I casually asked if either of them had tried opening my bedroom door during the night. Phil frowned immediately. No. I asked if he'd gone upstairs at all. He shook his head, saying, "I don't even remember falling asleep." I texted Micah afterward, mostly joking about it. His response came fast. "Wasn't me. That should have been the end of it." Instead, it got worse the following night. I spent most of Saturday out with friends and didn't get home until late. I wasn't drunk, just exhausted. The house was completely dark when I got back. I remember thinking how unusually quiet it felt. I showered, climbed into bed, and watched random videos on my phone until I started falling asleep. Right after turning my screen off, I heard a creak overhead. Then another. This time, it was footsteps. I sat up immediately. The sound moved slowly across the hallway upstairs. I listened carefully, trying to convince myself that some rats had sneaked their way in. I'd have to call an exterminator sometime soon. Then it stopped directly above my room. A few seconds later, my doorknob turned again. My entire body went cold. I stared at the door without breathing. Someone knocked 3 times. It wasn't loud or aggressive. It was almost polite. The person outside stayed there for what felt like forever. I could hear faint movement on the other side of the door, like someone shifting their weight. That was the moment I realized this wasn't one of my friends joking around. Nobody else was supposed to be inside the house. I quietly grabbed my phone and turned the brightness all the way down. My friend wasn't answering, neither was his wife. I considered climbing out my bedroom window, but something about opening that door between me and whoever was outside felt like a terrible idea, so I stayed completely still. Eventually, the footsteps moved away. I heard them going upstairs again, then everywhere went silent. I don't think I slept even 1 minute after that. Around sunrise, I finally worked up the courage to leave my room. I grabbed a heavy metal flashlight from my closet and opened the door slowly. The basement looked normal. I almost convinced myself I imagined everything. Then I noticed the stairway door upstairs was open. I knew I'd left it closed before going to bed. I walked upstairs slowly. The kitchen looked slightly off, with one cabinet door hanging open. A dining chair had been pulled away from the table, and sitting beside the sink was a half-empty glass of water. I hadn't used a glass. I only drank bottled water. I stood there staring at it when I heard a soft creak coming from upstairs. My heart started beating erratically. The bedrooms upstairs were on the second floor, which meant someone was still inside the house. I backed away slowly toward my basement stairs. Every instinct told me to run down and lock myself in, but part of me needed to know. I hesitated, then forced myself to climb halfway back up the stairs toward the second floor before stopping. At the end of the hallway, the guest bedroom door was barely open. I knew I'd never left it that way. The house suddenly felt impossibly quiet in an alarming way. I remember hearing my own heartbeat. I pushed the door open wider. At first, the room looked empty. Then I noticed the closet door. It was cracked open just enough for darkness to show through. And from inside that darkness, I saw movement. Not much, just enough to know someone was standing there, watching me. I don't even remember getting downstairs. I grabbed my keys, bolted through the side entrance, and locked myself inside my car parked across the street. For nearly an hour, I sat there staring at the house. Nobody came out. Eventually, I called Micah and begged him to come over. When he and Phil finally arrived later that morning, the three of us searched the entire house together. We found no one, no bags, no signs of forced entry. But in the upstairs hallway closet, we found something that hadn't been there before. An hoodie covered in the mud, a backpack filled with empty food wrappers, and several bottled waters from the refrigerator downstairs. Phil went pale immediately. It was clear to us that whoever had been hiding inside the house wasn't just there during the second night. They had most likely been there while the three of us were downstairs drinking and watching TV, close enough to hear every conversation we had, and maybe even watching us the entire time. That realization sat with me long after they arrived, and we searched the house again, this time slower, like we were expecting the truth to be hiding between objects rather than rooms. Every sound in the house felt different after that, like it had been used by someone who understood the layout better than we did. It made me question how often someone had been moving through the space without being seen. Even now, years later, I still catch myself checking locked doors twice before sleep, as if the house might remember how to let someone back in. I moved to a cabin in the mountains to be completely alone, but every night at exactly 1:13 a.m., someone tapped on my spare room window. The strange part was, I lived miles away from the nearest road. This dates back to a few years ago. I rented a small cabin in the kind of place you go when you want silence for good. It was supposed to be the best place to reset. Just me, the trees, and silence. The peaceful kind. The first few days were quite relieving. At night, I'd sit on the porch steps, watch darkness swallow the whole forest, and I remember thinking, this is what peace is supposed to feel like. Then the tapping started. It wasn't loud at first, just controlled. Always from the spare bedroom window at the back of the cabin. Always the same time, 1:13 a.m., like something was clocking in for work. I told myself it was roaches scurrying around, branches, anything my brain could excuse. The first night I checked, I grabbed a flashlight and walked straight in there, opened the curtains fast like I could catch whatever was messing with me off guard. Nothing outside but thick forest, black and unmoving like a wall had been painted over the world. So I laughed it off, because that's what you do when you're alone too long. But the second night the pattern changed because it wasn't random anymore. I stayed in the living room this time, watching the clock like it owed me money. And the second it hit 1:13, same window, same rhythm, same impossible timing. I walked toward it slower that time, half expecting it to stop again like it had before. But it didn't. It kept going until I was right outside the door. Then everywhere went silent, as if whatever it was could hear my footsteps thinking. That's when I stopped sleeping properly. On the fifth night, after it happened, I decided I wasn't backing away anymore. I sat right outside the spare room door, lights off, flashlight in hand. And when 1:13 hit, the tapping started immediately like it had been waiting for my decision. Except this time, I didn't move away from it. I stood up slowly, one step after the other until I was right in front of the window. I pulled the curtain back in one motion, expecting nothing again. But this time, something was already there. I grabbed the flashlight instantly. The beam hit the window, and a man flinched like light was something personal. Then he turned and ran into the trees without hesitation, and I made the worst decision of the night by following him. Branches whipped against my arms. I could see flashes between trunks, like he wasn't fully running away, more like he was leading me somewhere. And every time I thought I was catching up, he stayed just out of reach. I stopped near a break in the trees, trying to catch my breath. That's when I saw a phone. Mud-covered, half buried like it had been dropped in a hurry. I picked it up expecting it to be dead, but it wasn't. It lit up immediately. The gallery was already open, and the photos weren't random. They featured my cabin, from different angles. Some were clearly taken during the day when I was inside. Some were recent enough that I could still feel the moment they were taken. I kept scrolling anyway, not because I wanted to, but because stopping felt worse. Then, I opened the last photo, and fear gripped me instantly. It was taken minutes before I chased him into the forest. It showed me, standing at the window, looking out. But I didn't remember seeing a camera. I didn't remember anything like that. I dropped the phone like it burned my hand the moment I understood the pattern. I didn't mutter anything. I just walked to my apartment, packed up my things and headed back to the city. At the time, I felt like I had done more than enough resetting. And that brings us to the end of this video. If you want more stories that make quiet houses feel just a little too loud, subscribe to Deep Horror channel. Just don't say I didn't warn you when the noises start sounding familiar.